Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at Islamic rulings on women covering their bodies,
Okay.
specifically the face.
Sounds good.
You've given us this really fascinating collection of Quranic verses and Hadiths, and I'm really excited to kind of break down the arguments and all the nuances of this very complex issue.
Yeah, definitely. It's not a simple yes or no answer.
Right.
It's going to be a journey.
Yeah.
We're going to explore the reasoning behind different interpretations. We're going to look at the religious texts themselves and also the social context they emerged from.
Yeah.
So get ready for some surprises. Islamic scholarship is a lot more complex than many people realize.
All right, so let's dive in. We're going to start with Surah al-Noor 24.31.
Okay.
Which instructs women to lower their gaze and guard their modesty.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm already curious, how do we get from this verse to the idea of covering the face?
Right.
It feels like there's some interpretation happening here.
Yeah, that's a great observation. The verse itself doesn't explicitly say cover your face.
Right.
But some scholars argue that it's implied as a way to achieve that modesty. So it's almost like a detective story, right?
Yeah.
We're looking for clues, we're connecting the dots.
Yeah.
Some scholars focus on the literal words, while others look at the broader intention behind the verse.
So right off the bat, we see there's room for different perspectives.
For sure.
Now, the verse also mentions covering the jilbaab,
Yes.
which basically refers to the chest and neck area.
Mm-hmm.
Some scholars use this as an argument for covering the face.
Right.
What's the logic there?
So the argument is that if the chest and neck, which are already considered private areas, must be covered,
Right.
then the face being even more visually prominent should be covered as well. It's a bit like an analogy. If X needs covering, then surely Y, which is even more sensitive, needs it too.
Interesting. So it's about taking a principle and extending it to other areas.
Right.
But here's where it gets even more nuanced. The verse makes exceptions for old male servants who lack vigor
Yeah.
and small children. What does this tell us about the interpretation?
This is where the social norms of the time really come into play.
Okay.
It seems the idea is to minimize potential temptation or distraction,
Right.
but trying to apply these specific categories today would be tricky, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Think about it. Defining old or lacking vigor is subjective and depends on who's doing the defining.
Totally. It's like we're looking through a window into the past,
Yeah.
trying to understand how these rules were understood back then.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's another verse that really caught my eye.
Okay.
The one about women not stamping their feet to reveal hidden adornments like anklets.
Right.
What a vivid image. But how is this connected to covering the face?
It might seem like a leap, but scholars connect it to the broader theme of minimizing distractions.
Okay.
If a subtle sound can be distracting, imagine the visual impact of a face.
Right.
The argument is that covering helps create an environment where both men and women can maintain a focus on modesty and inner qualities.
It's about setting boundaries and expectations. Right.
Exactly.
So far, we've seen how different interpretations can stem from a single verse.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other Quranic verses that add to this conversation?
There are a few others, like verse 60 from Surah al-Noor and verses 59 and 55 from Surah al-Ahzaab.
Okay.
But the takeaway here is that the Quran lays down certain principles, and then it's up to scholars to interpret and apply those principles based on the context. And that's where the Hadiths come in.
Right.
They provide real-life examples and applications from the Prophet Muhammad's life.
It's like having a commentary on the original text,
Yeah.
showing how these principles were put into practice.
Exactly.
One hadith that really stood out to me was the one allowing a man proposing marriage to look at a woman.
Okay.
That seems to contradict the emphasis on covering, doesn't it?
It does seem that way on the surface, right?
Yeah.
But this is where the concept of intention becomes really important in Islamic law.
Okay.
The Hadith isn't saying all looking is permissible,
Right.
but rather that it's allowed when the intention is marriage. Actions are judged within a larger context.
So it's not just about the act itself, but the purpose behind it.
Right.
This makes me think about the hadith mentioning women wearing jilbaabs during Eid prayers.
Yes.
Does this suggest that covering at least to the extent of a jilbab was the norm back then?
That's one interpretation. It shows us that covering was definitely practiced during the Prophet's time.
Okay.
And the jilbab was a common form of covering.
Mm-hmm.
But even here, there are different opinions on exactly what a jilbab entailed back then and how it compares to modern-day interpretations.
It seems like every layer we peel back reveals even more nuances.
Definitely.
But then we have Aisha, the Prophet's wife, expressing concern about women being recognized in the mosque despite their veils.
This is where things get really intriguing.
Yeah.
She even suggests the prophet would prevented them from coming if he'd seen it.
Whoa.
She draws a parallel with the practices of another Abrahamic faith, which shows us that these conversations were happening even then.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into the early days of Islamic scholarship, seeing how different opinions were being formed and debated.
Absolutely.
Aisha's perspective also raises the question, what was considered sufficient covering then versus now?
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of individual interpretations within Islamic scholarship.
Okay.
It's not always a top-down decree, but a dynamic process of understanding and application.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Speaking of interpretations, another hadith mentions women letting their garments drag, connecting to covering the feet. Some scholars use this to argue for covering the face. How does that connection work?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too.
Okay.
It seems like a jump from feet to face.
The logic is this. If covering the feet, which are considered less tempting, is required, then covering the face, being a greater source of potential attraction, should be even more so.
Okay.
It's an argument by analogy, extending a principle from one area to another. But again, it relies on accepting that line of reasoning.
So it's not just about following rules, but understanding the reasoning and interpretations behind them.
Right.
We're seeing a pattern emerge here.
Yes.
A constant interplay between the texts, the context, and the interpretations.
And that interplay is what makes this topic so fascinating.
Yeah.
There's no single right answer.
Right.
But rather a spectrum of opinions backed by different interpretations of the sources.
I'm already feeling like I've learned so much. We've only just begun. What other fascinating twists and turns await us in this deep dive?
Well, next we're going to look at how Islamic scholars use logic and reasoning to support their interpretations.
Okay.
And we'll explore some of the potential consequences they associate with unveiling. This is where things get even more thought-provoking, so buckle up.
All right. I'm ready. All right. We've gone through some key Quranic verses and hadiths, and kind of seeing how interpretations can differ even when we're looking at the same text.
Yeah, for sure.
It feels like we've kind of laid out all the pieces of the puzzle. Now, how do they fit together?
That's a great way to put it. Islamic scholarship doesn't just stop at quoting verses right.
Right.
Scholars use logic reasoning analogy to build their arguments.
Okay.
Sort of like detectives piecing together evidence.
So it's not just about what the texts say, but the why behind the interpretations.
Exactly.
What are some of the key arguments scholars use when it comes to face covering?
One of the most important concepts is fitna.
Okay.
Now, for our listener who may not be familiar with this term, fitna is a complex idea.
Right.
Often translated as temptation or social unrest. It's about situations that could lead people astray morally or socially.
So how does fitna relate to the discussion on face covering?
Scholars who argue for face covering often say that unveiling can lead to increased fitna.
Okay.
The idea is that if a woman's face is uncovered, it could lead to unwanted attention or distraction, both for men and women. This goes back to the principle of modesty we were talking about earlier.
That makes sense. If the goal is to create an environment where everyone feels comfortable and focused on their inner qualities, then excessive attention to physical appearance could disrupt that balance.
Exactly. And our source material highlights some concerns.
Okay.
About unveiling, leading to things like women feeling pressure to constantly enhance their beauty, or interactions between men and women becoming overly focused on physical attraction.
It's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and eventually it erodes the values of modesty and humility that are central to Islamic teachings.
Right.
But doesn't this get tricky when we consider the modern world where men and women interact in all sorts of settings? Workplaces, schools, social events.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
And one that sparks a lot of debate. The source even mentions the mixing of genders as a potential consequence of unveiling.
Right. How do we apply these principles in a society where men and women are doctors, teachers, business partners working and interacting together every day?
Right. And this is where we see diverse opinions emerging within Islamic scholarship.
Okay.
Some scholars argue that the core values of modesty and lowering the gaze can still be maintained even in mixed gender environments, while others emphasize the importance of context and adapting interpretations to fit the situation.
So it's not about finding a one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
but about having thoughtful discussions and recognizing that different contexts might call for different approaches.
Precisely. And this is where another important concept comes in.
Okay.
Haya.
Haya.
It's often translated as modesty or shyness. It goes deeper than that.
Okay.
It's about having a sense of shame when it comes to violating moral boundaries.
So when discussing face covering, are we talking about haya as an inherent quality of women or as something shaped by societal expectations?
That's a great question, and one that gets to the heart of the debate.
Yeah.
Some argue that haya is a natural disposition, particularly for women. Others believe it's more about societal norms and expectations. It raises the question, are certain behaviors inherently immodest, or are they perceived that way because of cultural conditioning?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. I'm starting to see how this deep dive is less about finding the right answer and more about understanding the different layers of interpretation and how they interact with social contexts.
Exactly. We're learning how to think critically about these issues, recognize the diversity of thought within Islamic scholarship, and appreciate that this conversation is still ongoing, evolving as the world changes.
We've really only just scratched the surface here, haven't we? Each verse, each hadith, each concept opens up a whole new world of discussion and exploration.
It's true. And that's what makes studying Islamic rulings so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing rules, but about understanding the logic behind them, the debates they spark, and how they can be thoughtfully applied to our lives today.
We've explored some of the key arguments for face covering.
Right.
Now I'm wondering, what about those who hold different views? Are there counter-arguments to the points we've discussed?
Of course. Islamic scholarship is full of diverse opinions. Some scholars argue that the Quranic verses we discussed earlier are not about face covering at all, but about modesty in a broader sense. They point to alternative interpretations of terms like khimar and jilbab, suggesting they referred to different styles of dress back then.
So it's not just about disagreeing with the concept of modesty, but about how those concepts are interpreted and applied.
Exactly. There are also scholars who argue that the hadiths we discussed earlier need to be understood within their historical context.
Okay.
And may not be directly applicable to modern life. They emphasize the importance of individual agency and freedom of choice, suggesting that women should have the right to decide how they want to dress.
It sounds like this debate is less about right versus wrong and more about different ways of understanding the same texts and principles.
That's a great way to summarize it.
Yeah.
It's about engaging in respectful dialogue, recognizing the validity of different viewpoints, and ultimately making informed decisions based on our own understanding and conscience.
Speaking of informed decisions, you mentioned earlier that scholars often use logic and reasoning to support their interpretations.
Right.
Can you give us some examples of these arguments?
Absolutely. One line of reasoning focuses on the potential negative consequences of unveiling beyond the concept of fitna.
Okay.
Some scholars argue that if women are constantly focused on their appearance, it could distract them from pursuing knowledge contributing to society or fulfilling their spiritual potential.
That's an interesting point. It shifts the focus from outward appearance to inner development and societal contributions.
Exactly. There's also the argument that emphasizing physical beauty can lead to a culture of objectification,
Okay.
where women are valued more for their looks than for their intellect, character, or accomplishments.
It makes me think about how media and societal pressures can sometimes reinforce these ideas, creating unrealistic beauty standards that can be harmful.
Absolutely. And these concerns are not unique to Islamic thought.
Right.
Many cultures and societies grapple with these issues, questioning how to balance individual expression with broader societal values.
It seems like every step we take in this deep dive leads to even more questions and deeper reflections.
That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
We're not just learning information, we're learning how to think, critically engage with complex ideas, and appreciate the nuances of a centuries-old debate that's still relevant today.
I'm feeling my brain getting a workout. But before we wrap up this part of our exploration, I want to circle back to something you said earlier.
Oh, yeah?
You mentioned that some scholars emphasize individual agency and freedom of choice when it comes to dress.
Yeah,
Can you elaborate on that?
of course. This perspective emphasizes that Islam values free will and personal responsibility.
Okay.
While there are guidelines and principles to consider, ultimately, each individual is responsible for their own choices and actions.
So it's not about imposing a strict set of rules, but about providing a framework for making informed decisions.
Exactly. And within that framework, there's room for individual expression and interpretation. Some women might choose to cover their faces as an act of devotion or as a way to express their identity, while others might find different ways to embody the principles of modesty and haya.
It seems like this perspective recognizes that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to these complex issues.
Precisely. It encourages women to engage with the text, understand the different interpretations, and ultimately make choices that align with their own understanding of their faith and their personal values.
This deep dive has been a whirlwind of information, but it's also been incredibly eye-opening. It feels like we've moved beyond simplistic notions of right and wrong and entered a space of thoughtful discussion and nuanced understanding.
I couldn't agree more. It's been a journey of unpacking layers of interpretation, exploring historical and social contexts, and appreciating the diverse perspectives within Islamic scholarship.
I'm eager to see where this journey takes us next.
Yeah.
What other fascinating insights await us in the final part of our deep dive?
Well, we've explored the arguments and counter-arguments, the logic and reasoning behind different interpretations.
Right.
Now it's time to bring it all together. Connect it back to you, the listener, and leave you with some food for thought.
Okay.
Get ready for some big picture reflections and thought-provoking questions.
All right, I'm ready. Wow, what a journey this deep dive has been. We've gone from unpacking specific verses and hadiths to exploring the broader principles of Islamic scholarship, the role of logic and reasoning, and even the impact of societal norms.
Yeah, it's been like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Yeah.
Every layer reveals something new and adds to the complexity.
And I think that's the biggest takeaway for me, understanding that there isn't one right answer.
Yeah.
When it comes to Islamic rulings on face covering. It's about understanding the texts.
Right.
Engaging with different interpretations and recognizing the influence of cultural and historical contexts.
Exactly. And as we've seen, this conversation isn't just happening in some ivory tower. It's directly relevant to how Muslim women live their lives today.
Yeah.
The question of how to balance traditional values with modern realities is something that resonates with many people.
Yeah, it makes me think about all the Muslim women I know, doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs,
Right.
who are navigating these complexities every day.
Yeah.
They're making choices that align with their faith, their values, and their personal circumstances.
And those choices might look different for each individual.
Yeah.
Some women might choose to cover their faces as an expression of their faith, while others might find different ways to embody the principles of modesty and haya.
Right.
The beauty of Islamic scholarship is that it allows for this diversity of interpretation and application.
It's about empowering individuals to make informed decisions.
Yes.
Rather than imposing a rigid set of rules. And that process of learning, reflecting, and choosing is something that each person has to go through for themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most valuable things we can take away from this deep dive. It's not about finding a definitive answer, but about developing the tools and the understanding to navigate these complex questions.
So as we wrap up this exploration, what would you say is the most important question for our listener to ponder? What's the key takeaway that will stick with them even after they've finished listening?
That's a great question. For me, it comes back to the idea of personal responsibility.
Okay.
We've seen that Islamic scholarship is full of diverse opinions, nuanced interpretations, ongoing debates.
Right.
It's up to each individual to engage with these ideas, critically examine different perspectives, and ultimately make choices that align with their own understanding and conscience.
It's about taking ownership of our faith journey rather than blindly following what others tell us.
Exactly. It's about developing a deep and meaningful understanding of our own beliefs and values so we can make choices that are authentic and fulfilling.
I love that. It's like we've gone on an intellectual adventure exploring the historical, cultural, and philosophical dimensions of this topic. And at the end of the day, it's about using those insights to make informed decisions in our own lives.
And to approach these questions with an open mind, a willingness to learn, and a respect for the diversity of opinions within the Muslim community.
Beautifully said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. This deep dive has been a whirlwind of information.
It has.
But I hope it's left you, our listener, with a sense of wonder, a thirst for knowledge, and a deeper understanding of this complex and fascinating topic.
Remember, this is just the beginning of your exploration.
Yes.
We encourage you to continue researching, reflecting, and engaging with these important questions.
And who knows? Maybe your own personal deep dive will lead you to discover something new and insightful. Happy exploring.